She never thought silence could be so loud. It was a late Sunday afternoon in early fall, the kind where the sunlight drips through the blinds in golden stripes and everything feels suspended in quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something breaks. Margaret stood still in the hallway, one hand resting on the wall as if the house might tilt without her holding it up. She stared at the closed door, still hearing the echo of it slamming shut minutes ago. No goodbye, no glance back, just footsteps fading down the driveway. And then gone. He was gone. Richard, her husband of nearly 30 years. The man who once rubbed her feet when she was pregnant, who laughed so hard he snorted, who promised to grow old with her. That Richard. Now, all she had was the sound of the refrigerator humming and the sudden, sharp silence of her daughters, not knowing what to say. Emily, the oldest, stood near the couch, clutching a stuffed animal too small for her 11 years. Sophie, just 8, sat cross-legged on the floor, blinking in confusion, her tiny fingers tracing circles in the rug. They didn't cry, not yet. Margaret turned slowly, her bare feet brushing against the wood floor. Her robe hung loosely over her shoulders, the sleeves tugged low from long days of wear. She walked to the kitchen without speaking, picked up a glass, filled it with water, drank. Her reflection caught in the dark window above the sink. Tired eyes, graying curls pulled back in a careless bun, wrinkles along her cheeks that hadn't been there a year ago. She leaned in, squinted, and whispered to her own face, "Who are you?" Outside, the last crickets of the season chirped. A neighbor's car pulled into a driveway down the street. Life kept moving. But inside Margaret's house, time had stopped. She hadn't prepared for this. She'd survived so much, raising kids, losing her mother, working 2 jobs when times were tight. But this betrayal felt different. Not just abandonment, erasure. As if she had been written out of her own story without notice. And now, 2 little girls looked to her like she held all the answers. She didn't even have the questions yet. Emily walked over and tugged gently on her robe. "Mom," she said softly, "is Daddy coming back?" Margaret looked down at her daughter, the small, wide eyes so full of hope it nearly crushed her. She couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. She simply shook her head and knelt to pull both girls into her arms. That's when the tears came. Not loud, not messy. Just hot, silent streams sliding down her cheeks as she held them close. Her daughters. The only part of Richard that still felt real. The only part that mattered. She had been left, but not alone. And though she didn't know it yet, this moment here, kneeling on the kitchen floor with 2 girls in her arms and grief sitting heavy on her chest, would be the beginning. Not of her ending, but of her becoming. The next morning arrived too fast. Margaret woke up before the sun, not because she wanted to, but because her body no longer trusted sleep. Her bed felt wider than usual, quieter. She reached instinctively to the other side, touching the cold sheet where Richard used to sleep. Still empty, still gone. Down the hall, she heard the soft sound of Emily and Sophie getting dressed. They hadn't said much the night before. After their embrace in the kitchen, the girls clung to her in silence until they drifted to sleep on either side of her in bed, their small hands curled like question marks. Margaret forced herself up, wrapped her robe tighter around her body, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and stared into the mirror like it might give her instructions. It didn't. In the kitchen, she set the table like she always did. 4 plates, 4 forks, 4 chairs. Habit. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered above the last plate. Slowly, she pulled it back. She stared at the 2 empty chairs across from where the girls would sit. They looked enormous now, hollow, like waiting rooms for someone who would never come. She left the 2 extra settings on the counter, turned back to the table, and lit a small candle beside the orange juice carton. The flicker helped somehow, like it was holding the space between what was and what now had to be. Emily came in first. She wore the same hoodie she'd slept in, sleeves pulled over her hands. She sat down quietly, eyes scanning the room without landing on anything. Sophie followed, her curls half brushed, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She climbed into her chair, legs swinging, and looked around. "Why are there only 3 plates?" she asked. Margaret took a breath. "Because there are only 3 of us now, baby." Silence. Emily looked up, finally meeting her mother's eyes. "Is he coming back?" Margaret sat down slowly. She didn't want to lie, but the truth was too big to say out loud, at least not yet. So she did what mothers do when their hearts are breaking. She softened her voice and chose words that felt safe. "I don't know," she said, "but we're going to be okay." Sophie poked at her eggs. "But Daddy always makes the toast too brown," she said quietly. Margaret managed a small smile. "I never liked his toast anyway." That made Sophie giggle, and even Emily's lips twitched. They ate slowly without rush, as if chewing helped hold back whatever feelings were trying to spill out. Margaret didn't taste anything. She just watched them, her girls, and wondered how she was going to carry all this pain and still be what they needed. After breakfast, she packed their lunch boxes and kissed their foreheads before they left for school. She stood at the doorway, waving as they walked down the block, backpacks bouncing behind them. When they disappeared around the corner, Margaret stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and leaned against it. The house was too quiet again. She walked over to the dining table, still set for 3. The 2 empty chairs stared back at her like ghosts. And for the first time that morning, Margaret let herself cry. It had only been 4 days since Richard left, but already Margaret could feel the shift in the air outside her front door. The neighborhood hadn't changed, not really. The same breeze rustled through the magnolia trees. The same dogs barked in the same backyards. The same neighbors watered their lawns or swept their porches. But now, when Margaret stepped outside, she felt watched, not by cruelty, by pity, which sometimes hurt worse. It started with the long looks, then came the short questions, and soon the whispers. That morning she stood on the porch, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. Her robe flapped lightly in the breeze as she stared at the street like it might offer an answer. Maybe if she stood still enough, quiet enough, Richard would just come walking back up the driveway. Like none of this had happened. She knew better. Down the block, Miss Ella was watering her rose bushes with the same precision she gave to everything. She glanced up, then quickly back down. Margaret sighed. Just then Linda's screen door creaked open next door. Linda was one of the few neighbors who didn't hide her concern behind politeness. She came out carrying a Tupperware container and a kind of nervous energy that always seemed to follow her around. "Hey, girl," Linda said gently, walking up the path. "I made that sweet potato casserole your girls like. Figured they could use something warm." Margaret tried to smile. "Thank you." Linda hesitated, looking down at the container like it might say something for her. "I'm not trying to be in your business," she began, "but folks been talking." Margaret stiffened slightly. "Of course they have." Linda nodded, shifting her weight. "You know how people are. They don't know what happened, so they make up their own version. Somebody said they saw Richard over at Eastwood Plaza with some younger woman." Margaret didn't flinch, but something behind her eyes blinked out. She took the casserole. "Thank you, Linda, for the food." Linda paused, unsure if she should stay. "I'm just down the street if you need anything, okay?" Margaret nodded. "I know." When Linda walked away, Margaret stood there for a long time, the casserole warm in her hands, but her chest hollow. Later that afternoon, Emily came home from school quieter than usual. Margaret knew that kind of quiet. It was the kind that tried to hold in what wanted to come out. She waited until Sophie was in the living room watching cartoons, then sat with Emily at the kitchen table. "You okay?" she asked. Emily shrugged. "Some kids were talking." Margaret swallowed. "What did they say?" Emily kept her eyes on her hands. "That Daddy left us. That he doesn't want to come back. That he's got someone new." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "People talk, baby. Doesn't mean they know anything about what's in our hearts." "But is it true?" Emily whispered. "Does he have someone else?" Margaret didn't lie. "Maybe, but that's his choice, and his mistake." Emily nodded, her chin trembling just a little. Margaret leaned in closer. "You know what matters more than anything?" "What?" "That you and your sister are mine, and I'm not going anywhere." Emily blinked fast, then got up and hugged her mother tightly around the neck. Outside, someone's wind chime jingled softly in the evening air. Inside, Margaret closed her eyes and held her daughter close. Let them whisper. She had better things to listen to. Sunday came, as it always did. And with it, the quiet pressure to get dressed, smile politely, and sit in the same church pew where Richard used to place his hand gently on Margaret's knee during prayer. She didn't want to go. Not this week, not yet. But the girls needed routine. Something steady, something familiar. So she pressed her hair back into a neat bun, put on her dark green dress, the one with the loosened hemline she still hadn't stitched, and guided Emily and Sophie into their shoes. Sophie clutched a small Bible and hummed softly to herself. The ride to church was short, but the silence stretched long. When they pulled into the gravel parking lot, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't afraid of questions. She was afraid of the kindness, the kind that came with tilted heads and voices lowered like condolences. As they walked inside, warm greetings echoed around them. "Good morning, Sister Margaret." "Hey, baby, good to see you." "How are those sweet girls of yours?" She smiled, nodded, kept walking. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and lilies. Stained glass bathed the walls in soft colors. The choir was already warming up, their harmonies rising like smoke toward the ceiling. Margaret took her usual spot, third pew from the front, left side. The girls sat on either side of her, legs swinging just above the floor. And then there it was, the question. A soft voice, just behind her. "Where's Brother Richard today?" Margaret turned, meeting the eyes of Mrs. Jennings, a long-time member in her 70s with a voice like velvet and a mouth that never quite stopped moving. "Oh, he's not here this morning," Margaret replied. Mrs. Jennings raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Just gave that knowing nod, the kind women give when they've seen too many stories end the same way. As the service began, Margaret sat motionless. The pastor's voice boomed, the choir lifted hearts with praise, and hands raised around her in worship. But she felt disconnected, as if floating just outside her own body. When prayer time came, people stood and asked for healing, for strength, for financial breakthroughs. Margaret kept her lips closed. She thought about standing, about asking for peace, for direction, for courage. But the words never made it to her mouth. Because how do you explain that the thing you lost wasn't just a husband, but the life you built around him? That your silence isn't stubbornness, but survival? Emily leaned into her, whispering, "Are you okay, Mama?" Margaret nodded. "I'm fine, baby." But she wasn't. After service, as they made their way toward the exit, the same soft, pitying stares followed her. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Hugs that lingered too long. Outside, as the girls ran ahead toward the car, Margaret overheard two women talking behind her. "Poor thing," one whispered. "She won't last long on her own." The other replied, "You know he's been gone a while. This ain't new." Margaret didn't turn around, didn't respond. She opened the car door, let the girls climb in, and stared straight ahead as she slid into the driver's seat. Inside, she was boiling, but on the surface, silence. The weight of it followed her all the way home. Not just the silence of Richard leaving, but the silence of a world that expects women like her to carry it all and not make a sound. Margaret always knew Emily was sharp. But lately, her oldest daughter had become something else too. Watchful. Protective in a way no 11-year-old should have to be. She noticed everything. How long Margaret stayed quiet at dinner. How often she stared into space while washing dishes. How her eyes swelled from crying behind closed doors. Emily never said anything. She just adjusted. She started making her own bed, brushing Sophie's hair in the morning, even packing part of her sister's lunch. Little acts of quiet defense against the chaos, against the ache. That Tuesday, Margaret got a call from the school. The vice principal wanted to speak with her. When she arrived, she found Emily sitting stiffly in a small office chair, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. The principal looked tired. "Mrs. Green, we had a little incident today. Emily stepped in during recess. Apparently some of the kids were teasing Sophie." Margaret's heart tightened. "What kind of teasing?" He glanced at Emily, then back to her. "Another student said something about your husband leaving. Sophie got upset. Emily, well, she intervened." "Did she hurt anyone?" "No," he said. "But she got loud, protective. Said some words. Honestly, I'd call it courage more than misbehavior, but protocol requires we notify parents." Margaret turned to Emily, whose jaw was clenched. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, surprising both the principal and her daughter. On the way home, they didn't speak until they turned the last corner. "I'm not sorry," Emily said suddenly, voice steady. "They don't know anything about us. I wasn't going to let them hurt Sophie." Margaret blinked, fighting tears. "You shouldn't have to protect her, baby. That's my job." Emily shook her head. "You're already doing everything." That broke something in Margaret, not from weakness, but from awe. Her daughter wasn't just growing up. She was stepping in. Later that night after dinner, Sophie crawled onto Margaret's lap with her blanket and whispered, "Emily told them Daddy's dumb." Margaret chuckled, pulling her close. "Did she now?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "She said he left, but we didn't break." Margaret looked over at Emily, who was curled up on the couch with a book, pretending not to listen. "We didn't break," Sophie repeated. Margaret held her tighter. No, they hadn't. Cracked, maybe. Bent. Scarred in ways too deep to name. But not broken. Never broken. As she tucked the girls into bed that night, Margaret paused at the doorway and watched them. Emily already dozing, one hand still clutching her book. Sophie wrapped around her rabbit, breathing softly. These girls were not just her children. They were her mirror, her strength, her armor. She didn't know how long it would take to rebuild the pieces of herself Richard had chipped away. But one thing was already clear. She wasn't doing it alone. The hardest part of healing, Margaret realized, was that the world didn't stop to let you do it. Bills still came. Groceries still had to be bought. Clothes still needed washing. And people just kept moving like nothing had changed. That Saturday, Margaret went to the local supermarket just a few blocks from the house. It was the same store she'd gone to for over a decade, where the cashier knew her name and the stock boy used to help load water jugs into Richard's truck. She walked slowly through the aisles, pushing the cart as Emily and Sophie debated over cereal brands. The girls were laughing about something. Something simple. Something good. and for a brief moment Margaret felt like she could breathe again. Then she heard it. That voice. That deep, familiar laugh that once lived in her kitchen, at her dinner table, in her bed. It came from just around the corner, from the next aisle over. Careless, full, unbothered. Richard. Her body stiffened before her mind even caught up. She couldn't see him yet, but her heart already knew. And then came another voice. A woman's. Young, sweet, flirty. Margaret didn't need to see to understand. Emily looked up at her, sensing the shift. Mama? I need you to take your sister and wait by the checkout, Margaret said quietly, pressing a box of pasta into her daughter's hand. Emily hesitated, eyes searching her mother's face. Now, Em. Without arguing, she took Sophie's hand and led her away. Margaret stood alone in the aisle, staring at a row of canned tomatoes, heart pounding so loud she couldn't hear the music playing over the speakers anymore. Then she turned the corner. There he was. Richard. Same pressed jeans, same walk, same smirk he wore when he was trying too hard to charm someone. And beside him, a younger woman, barely 30, hair long and styled, her hand resting casually on his arm as she laughed at something he'd said. They didn't see Margaret. They just kept walking, kept laughing, kept living, as if she had never existed. She stood frozen, gripping the handle of her cart so hard her knuckles ached. Her throat tightened, and for a second, she thought she might collapse right there, next to the bags of flour and sugar. But she didn't. She turned, walked to the front of the store, and found the girls waiting exactly where she asked. Sophie had picked out stickers. Emily was watching the door like a guard. They didn't ask questions. Margaret didn't offer answers. They paid, walked out, loaded the groceries in silence. But once the car door closed, Margaret couldn't hold it anymore. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Her vision blurred. A single sob escaped, raw, short, involuntary. Emily reached from the back seat and gently placed her hand on her mother's shoulder. You don't have to be strong right now, she whispered. We've got you. Margaret closed her eyes. The ache inside her chest wasn't just from seeing him with someone else. It was from the realization that he was already gone long before he left. That the man in the store was not the same one she had built her life around. That, maybe, he never really had been. She took a deep breath, started the car, and drove home, still aching, but still moving. The past few weeks had blurred into a routine Margaret hadn't chosen, just one she had no choice but to accept. Wake up early, make breakfast, walk the girls to the bus stop, search for work, stretch the groceries, ignore the quiet hum of anxiety that lived behind every unpaid bill. The house, once filled with music and warmth, now felt heavy with effort. Every corner seemed to echo with something unfinished, a faucet that still dripped, a light bulb that needed replacing, a drawer that stuck. But Margaret didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't fix anything. Late one evening, after putting the girls to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a pile of envelopes in front of her. Most of them were bills. Some were warnings. She opened the electric bill last, already knowing what it would say. Past due. Again. The number at the bottom felt like a verdict. She rubbed her temples. The refrigerator buzzed quietly behind her, the only other sound in the house. She looked around the dim kitchen. Her eyes landed on the magnet board, still holding a sticky note that Richard had left months ago. Pick up milk. Love you. She hadn't taken it down. She did now. That night she couldn't sleep. Instead, she pulled out an old notebook from the closet, the one she used to jot down ideas in before life got too busy, too loud. Inside were scribbled cake recipes, sewing measurements, and lists of things she once wanted to try selling at church fairs. Baking, alterations, childcare, small skills, quiet skills, but skills nonetheless. The next day she made calls, printed flyers, reached out to a friend from church who ran a daycare out of her home, asked questions she never thought she'd need to ask at 62. By the end of the week, she had picked up 2 small sewing jobs, hemming pants for an older neighbor and patching a backpack for one of Emily's classmates. It wasn't much, but it was something. That Friday, as Margaret folded laundry in the living room, she found a folded piece of paper tucked inside one of Emily's socks. She opened it, expecting a doodle or a list, but it was a note. In Emily's neat handwriting, "Mom, I know things are hard, but I believe in you. You're stronger than him, and you're stronger than you think." Margaret sat down slowly, the note trembling in her hands. For all the pain Richard had left behind, for all the broken pieces scattered across her days, her daughters were still whole, still watching, still believing. And that had to mean something. That night, she made homemade cornbread and beans, not because it was special, but because it was warm and filling and theirs. They ate at the same kitchen table, still missing a 4th plate, but somehow it didn't feel quite as empty. Margaret didn't feel strong yet. Not really, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was drowning either. She was learning quietly, painfully, how to hold the house together, not with money or a man, but with persistence, pride, and love. It started with thunder, distant at first, like a slow drumbeat approaching the edge of town. By dinner time, the wind had picked up, and the sky turned the kind of gray that feels like warning. Heavy clouds pressed low over the rooftops, and the air smelled like rain. Margaret watched from the window as the first drops hit the porch steps. Sophie clung to her side. "I don't like storms," she whispered. "I know, baby," Margaret said softly, "but we're safe." The power went out around 8:17 p.m. The house sighed into darkness. Sophie screamed, not loud but sharp, her small hands clutching her mother's arm like an anchor. Emily grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer without being asked. She turned it on and handed it to Margaret, who set it upright on the table. Its soft yellow beam lit the room just enough to keep the shadows at bay. Margaret lit 2 candles and placed them on opposite ends of the kitchen. The storm outside howled louder now, slamming rain against the windows and rattling the roof like angry fingers tapping. Sophie refused to let go. "I'm scared," she said, voice trembling. Margaret knelt down, pulling both girls into her arms. She wrapped an old quilt around them and sat down on the couch, rocking gently, humming a tune her mother used to hum when the power went out in her childhood home. It wasn't a song, just sound. Warm sound. "You remember what I told you?" Margaret whispered. Sophie nodded against her chest. "We're safe." Emily leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. "And we have each other." For a long time, they just sat like that, the 3 of them, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by flickering candlelight and the growl of the storm. Margaret didn't realize she'd started crying until a tear slipped down and landed in Sophie's hair. She wiped it quickly. These girls weren't just her responsibility. They were her sanctuary. She used to think Richard was her protector, the one who stood between her and the world. But now she saw it clearly. Protection isn't loud. It doesn't come with doors slammed or money thrown or apologies handed out like breadcrumbs. Protection was this: a mother rocking her daughters through a storm she couldn't control, a child reaching for her sister in the dark, a flashlight in a drawer remembered by heart. Eventually, the thunder began to fade, rolling into the distance. The rain softened. The windows stopped trembling. Emily had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Sophie was close behind, her breathing steady now. Margaret carried them both to bed, one at a time, tucking them in with care. Then she returned to the living room and sat in the silence, watching the candlelight flicker across the walls. The house was still dark, but not cold. Not anymore. She wasn't just surviving, she was becoming something else entirely. The next morning, the house smelled like rain-soaked earth and burnt toast. Margaret had been distracted, too lost in her thoughts to watch the bread. She scraped off the charred edges, handed plates to the girls, and forced a smile that almost felt real. After they left for school, the silence returned. It didn't feel quite as heavy as it once did, but it still lingered like fog in the corners. Margaret moved through the house like a woman chasing ghosts. She folded laundry, wiped down the counters, stared at Richard's old coffee mug, still sitting in the back of the cupboard where she hadn't dared touch it. She pulled it out, held it for a moment, then set it gently in the donation box by the door. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the dining table, now permanently set for 3, with a blank sheet of paper and a pen. She hadn't written anything in weeks, but the words came fast, too fast. Richard, I don't know why I'm writing this. You probably don't care, but I need to say it, even if no one ever reads it. You left me with 2 girls who ask questions I don't have answers for. You walked away like this life we built was disposable, like I was disposable. I gave you decades. I gave you my body, my loyalty, my quiet. I swallowed so much silence I forgot what my voice sounded like. But I'm remembering now. You didn't just break your promises. You broke the woman who believed them. But here's the part you didn't expect. I'm still here, and they're still laughing, and I'm still standing. Her hand trembled as she set the pen down. She stared at the letter for a long time. Then slowly, carefully, she folded it once, twice, 3 times, and tore it into pieces. One, then another, then another. The paper fluttered into the trash like soft white feathers. She didn't need him to read her words. She didn't need him to understand. The truth had already done its job. It had freed her. In the stillness that followed, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself feel everything. Not to bury it, not to analyze it, but to let it pass through her like a wave that wouldn't drown her this time. And when she opened her eyes, the room didn't look so dim anymore. She stood, washed her teacup, opened the window, let the crisp autumn air roll in. The girls would be home soon. There were groceries to plan, homework to check, a neighbor's pants to finish hemming. Life hadn't become easy, but for the first time Margaret realized it was hers again. No one else would write her ending, and she didn't need to send that letter, because she had already said everything that mattered to herself. Spring came slowly that year. The trees took their time blooming, the grass stayed dull and patchy well into March, and the wind still bit at the edges of morning. But one afternoon, Margaret stepped onto the porch and noticed something. The air no longer carried the weight of winter. It smelled like possibility. She had just finished a sewing job, a custom pillow cover for a neighbor, and the few dollars tucked into her purse weren't much, but they were hers, earned with her hands, her time. She swept the porch in silence, the sunlight soft on her arms, her curls loose around her shoulders. For once, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. From the yard, she heard Sophie's voice. "Mama, close your eyes." Margaret looked up. Sophie was running toward her, one fist clenched tight around something. "Close them," Sophie insisted. Margaret obeyed, smiling. She felt small fingers press something into her palm. "Okay, now look." Margaret opened her eyes. It was a flower, a tiny yellow one, half crushed, its stem crooked, one petal already falling. Sophie beamed. "It's for you." Margaret looked down at the flower, tears rising so fast it surprised her. "It's perfect," she whispered. "No, it's not," Sophie giggled. "It's kind of squished." Margaret bent down and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "It's perfect because you picked it." Emily was sitting on the steps, notebook in hand, scribbling something. She looked up briefly, caught the moment, then went back to her writing. Later that night, while folding laundry, Margaret found another small surprise. A drawing stuffed into the bottom of the laundry basket. It was crude, drawn in colored pencil, but she recognized it immediately. 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun. One had a big curly puff of hair. One had 2 braids. The smallest one had her arms stretched out wide. At the bottom, in all caps, "Just us, and that's enough." Margaret laughed, a real laugh, from her belly. It had been so long. She pinned the drawing on the fridge with a magnet. It covered part of an old bill, and for once, she didn't care. After the girls were asleep, Margaret stepped outside again. The stars were just starting to appear. The neighborhood was quiet, not heavy this time, just peaceful. She thought about how far she'd come without anyone clapping. No spotlight, no dramatic transformation, just one breath at a time, one load of laundry, one meal, one bedtime story. Strength wasn't loud, it wasn't shiny. It was in the squashed flower, the wrinkled drawing, the steady hum of a woman who refused to disappear. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to the dark, "We're going to be all right." And for the first time, she believed it. It had been months since Margaret had seen Richard in the grocery store. She hadn't planned to see him again, not in real life, not in person. She had stopped checking his social media, stopped asking mutual friends, stopped wondering where he was or who he was with. But life has its own timing. The community spring fair had always been part of their family rhythm. Funnel cakes, local vendors, church choirs, and face painting for the kids. Emily had begged to go, and Sophie had already picked out her favorite dress. So Margaret said yes. They arrived just after noon. The air was warm, the park buzzing with music and the hum of conversation. Families strolled between booths. Someone was barbecuing nearby. Children laughed freely. Margaret held both girls' hands, walking slowly through the crowd. And then, like a cold gust through a warm day, she saw him. Richard. Standing by the lemonade stand, sunglasses perched on his head, hand resting casually on the shoulder of that same young woman. She was laughing, he was smiling. Margaret froze for just a second. He didn't see her. Or maybe he did, and chose not to react. He turned slightly, leaned into the woman, said something low. She threw her head back laughing, unaware of the small earthquake that had just occurred 20 feet away. Emily felt her mother's grip tighten. "Mama," she asked. "I see him," Margaret said, calm, measured. "You want to leave?" Emily asked. Margaret paused, looked down at her daughters. Sophie was licking an ice pop, entirely unbothered. Emily was watching her carefully, like she was bracing for impact. "No," Margaret said. "We came for the fair." And with that, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and kept walking. Straight ahead, not toward him, not away from him, just forward. She didn't lower her head, didn't speed up. She walked with dignity, the girls on either side of her, sunlight catching in her silver curls. As they passed the lemonade stand, Richard turned, just for a moment. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't wave, neither did she. There was nothing left to say, nothing worth giving him. But the way she walked, back straight, eyes calm, hands holding the future, said everything. He looked away first. Sophie tugged at her sleeve. "Can we go get our faces painted now?" Margaret smiled. "Let's do it." They walked on, through the crowd, through the noise, through the history. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. He had become a part of the past, and she had stepped fully into her own life, on her terms. That night, the house was quiet in the way that only peace can make it. No storm, no tension, No waiting for a voice that would never come through the door again. Just soft breathing from the girl's room, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the gentle creak of floorboards as Margaret moved barefoot through the hallway. She peeked into the girl's room. Sophie was fast asleep, curled into a soft ball of curls and blankets, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a treasure. Emily was sprawled out, one leg half off the bed, a book open on her chest. They looked so whole, so untouched by the chaos Richard had left behind. Or maybe not untouched, just undefeated. Margaret walked back to the living room, wrapped herself in her shawl, and sat in her favorite chair by the window. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting a pale light across the front yard. She sipped a cup of tea, chamomile slightly too strong, and breathed in the quiet. It wasn't the life she had planned, not the retirement full of travel, not the golden years with a partner at her side, not the house full of grandchildren and long, lazy Sunday mornings, but it was hers. And in that moment, she didn't feel lacking. She felt grounded. She thought of all she had lost: trust, comfort, routine, the illusion of security, the future she thought she was promised. And then she thought of all she had found in its place: resilience, self-respect, new beginnings, and small, brave steps. She had learned to live without apology, to cry when it hurt and laugh when it didn't, to build a new kind of home, not just for her daughters, but for herself. Outside the window, the streetlight flickered once, then settled. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves in a hush that sounded like a blessing. Margaret closed her eyes. She didn't need to write anything down, didn't need to send a final message or deliver a grand speech. The story had already been written, in the quiet moments, in the hard choices, in the love that never gave up. She whispered to herself, to no one and to everyone at once, "We were always enough." Then she rose, turned out the light, and walked down the hallway toward her daughters. Not broken, not bitter, not waiting, just whole. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after being left behind, if you've ever had to be strong for someone else while falling apart yourself, if you've found love in unexpected places, like the arms of your children or the sound of your own voice, tell your story. There's someone out there who needs to hear it.